doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I drank 3 hours ago from a spring near the base of Mount Chocorua, and what's been happening to me ever since. I'm an experienced hiker, the kind who laughs at superstitions and trusts science, the kind who researches soil composition and mineral content before every trip. I knew about the curse. Everyone does. How Chief Chocorua supposedly poisoned these waters with his dying breath back in 1720. How settlers' cattle died for generations afterward from something they called Burton's Ale. How even now the springs around this mountain run toxic with natural minerals like muriate of lime. I knew all of this, treated it like folklore wrapped around geology. And I drank from that spring anyway, because my filter was working and I understood chemistry. But here's what they don't tell you in the trail guides. What no geological survey has ever explained. Sometimes the poison and the curse are the same thing, and sometimes understanding the science doesn't save you from what's real. The water tasted wrong going down, metallic and ancient, like drinking liquid stone, but I told myself it was just the mineral content. Nothing my body couldn't handle. I'd filtered it twice, watched the clear stream run through my purification system, done everything right according to every wilderness safety protocol I'd memorized over 15 years of hiking these mountains. The spring itself looked pristine, bubbling up from between granite slabs near where the old Burton settlement used to be, before they changed the town's name to Albany just to escape the reputation of their dying livestock. I even laughed about it as I filled my bottles, thinking how superstitious those old settlers must have been, blaming a curse for what turned out to be simple chemistry, a problem they eventually solved with soapsuds and meadow mud. Science won, right? The rational explanation triumphed over indigenous legend, and modern hikers like me could drink safely as long as we understood the geology. That's what I believed 3 hours ago. The first sign that something was wrong came about 20 minutes after I drank. I was making good time up the trail, feeling strong, enjoying the afternoon light filtering through the birches, when I felt this sudden wave of cold pass through my chest, like I'd swallowed ice instead of spring water. Not painful exactly, just wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. My hands started tingling, and I noticed my vision sharpening in this strange way. Like every detail of the forest around me suddenly came into hyper-real focus. I could see individual bark patterns on trees 50 feet away, could hear water moving underground beneath the trail, could smell things I shouldn't have been able to smell, wood smoke that wasn't there, something cooking that smelled like meat and herbs, traces of scent that felt impossibly old. I stopped walking and checked my pulse, found it racing but steady. Told myself it was just dehydration or elevation or some weird anxiety response, even though I'd never felt anything like this in 15 years of mountain hiking. That's when I saw the first one. Not clearly at first, just movement at the edge of my vision. A figure standing between two white pines about 30 yards off the trail. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, just trees and undergrowth and afternoon shadows. But the image had been so vivid for that half second. A man wearing clothes I didn't recognize, some kind of leather tunic and leggings, holding something that might have been a rifle or a long stick, just standing perfectly still and watching me. I called out, asked if anyone was there, heard my voice echo strangely in the woods, like the sound was traveling through water instead of air. No response, just the wind moving through the canopy, and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light and shadow, kept hiking, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and that cold feeling in my chest was spreading outward into my limbs. The second figure appeared 10 minutes later, and this time I saw it clearly for almost 5 full seconds before it vanished. A woman this time, or what looked like a woman, standing directly on the trail about 50 feet ahead of me, wearing a long dress that looked handmade, colonial era maybe, her hair covered with some kind of cloth bonnet. She was facing away from me, looking up toward the summit of Chocorua, And she was crying. I could see her shoulders shaking. Could hear these awful hitching sobs that sounded like they were coming from inside my own head instead of from her. I stopped walking, felt my legs lock up with instinctive fear, and called out to her. Asked if she needed help, if she was lost, if she was real. She turned then, and I saw her face. And listen to me when I tell you this. Her features were clear as day, more real than anything I'd ever hallucinated or dreamed, and her eyes were looking at me with this expression of pure grief and terror that made my stomach drop. She opened her mouth like she was going to speak, and then she just wasn't there anymore. Gone between one blink and the next, leaving nothing but empty trail and the sound of wind and my own panicked breathing. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong with me. When I understood that whatever I'd drunk from that spring was doing things that couldn't be explained by simple mineral poisoning. I pulled out my phone to call for help, saw that I had no signal this deep in the mountains, and tried to think rationally through the rising panic. Myriad of lime poisoning causes nausea, weakness, digestive problems. It doesn't cause detailed hallucinations of people who aren't there. Chemical contamination doesn't make you see specific historical figures wearing period-accurate clothing. I'd researched this mountain's geology extensively, knew exactly what toxins might be in the water, and none of them should have been producing these effects. But my hands were still shaking. That cold had spread through my entire body now, and I was seeing things that felt too real, too specific, too historically grounded to be random misfiring neurons. The third figure appeared when I tried to leave the trail, tried to take a shortcut back down to the parking area because I knew I needed to get to a hospital, needed someone to tell me what was happening to my brain. He stepped out from behind a boulder, like he'd been waiting there for me, like he knew exactly where I was going to walk. An older man this time, white settler by the look of his rough wool clothes and the ancient rifle he was carrying, and his face was twisted with rage and grief in equal measure. He was shouting something at me, screaming words I couldn't quite hear but could somehow feel, accusations that vibrated in my chest like bass notes from a speaker. He pointed at me with one shaking hand, pointed up at the summit of Chocorua, pointed at the ground beneath my feet, and his mouth was forming words that I suddenly understood even though I couldn't hear them. You killed him. You poisoned him. You murderers took everything. And then he was gone, vanished like smoke, leaving me alone on the trail with the terrible understanding that I wasn't just hallucinating. I was seeing the history of this place, the actual events that led to the curse, the grief and rage and violence that soaked into this mountain soil 200 years ago. I ran then, abandoned any pretense of rational hiking, just scrambled downslope as fast as I could move. And that's when they all appeared at once. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, figures standing among the trees all around me. Colonists and indigenous people all mixed together, all watching me with expressions ranging from sorrow to fury to desperation. I saw a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7, lying on the ground convulsing while 3 women tried to hold him down, and I knew without being told that I was watching him die from fox poison, watching the exact moment that started this whole terrible chain of events. I saw a man being chased up the slope by a group of settlers with rifles and torches, saw him reaching the rocky summit and turning to face his pursuers, saw his mouth open in what I somehow knew was a curse even though I couldn't hear the words. I saw cattle collapsing in fields, their sides heaving, foam coming from their mouths, while farmers stood helpless, watching their livelihoods die. I saw all of it at once, layered over the present-day forest, like transparent film. History and present occupying the same space, and I understood then that the water hadn't just poisoned me. It had opened something in my perception, had let me see what this mountain remembers, had connected me to the grief and rage that never left the soil. I'm at my car now. I made it down somehow. Don't really remember the last mile of trail. My hands are still shaking as I write this, and the visions have faded to occasional flickers at the edge of my sight, shadows that might be trees or might be people who died centuries ago. I called poison control from the parking lot, told them what I drank, where I drank it from, described my symptoms as best I could without sounding completely insane. They told me to get to a hospital immediately, that muriate of lime poisoning is treatable but needs fast intervention, that hallucinations could indicate severe toxicity. But here's the thing that's keeping me from starting my car, the detail that won't let me dismiss this as simple chemical poisoning. I took photos. When the visions started getting intense, some rational part of my brain thought to document what I was seeing, thought maybe my phone camera would show me the truth of whether these figures were real or hallucinated. I just looked at those photos, and they shouldn't show anything except empty forest and trail, should just be proof that I was hallucinating people who weren't there. But they don't show empty forest. They show figures, dozens of them, faint but visible in the background of every shot, translucent human shapes standing exactly where I saw them, wearing exactly the clothes I described. Their faces turned toward my camera with expressions I can still see clearly. I'm driving to the hospital now because I have to, because my hands won't stop shaking, and there's something wrong with my vision, and I can taste metal at the back of my throat. But I already know what the doctors are going to find. They're going to test my blood and find elevated mineral levels, probably some muriate of lime or other natural toxins from that spring, and they're going to treat me with chelation therapy or activated charcoal or whatever protocol they use for this kind of poisoning, and I'm going to recover physically. The toxins will leave my system, my hands will stop shaking, my vision will return to normal, and in a few days, I'll be fine according to every medical test they can run. But I also know that I saw something real on that mountain, that the water didn't just poison my body but opened some door in my perception that maybe shouldn't have been opened, that Chief Chocorua's curse and the geological poisoning aren't separate things at all. They're the same phenomenon viewed from different angles, the same truth expressed in different languages. The settlers thought it was a curse, and when they discovered the mineral poisoning, they thought science had disproven the legend. But what if they were both right? What if the grief and rage that Chocorua poured into this mountain as he died actually did poison the water? Not metaphorically, but literally. Not through magic, but through some process we don't have words for yet. Some way that human emotion and geological chemistry can become the same thing. What if the minerals in that water don't just damage your body, but open your perception to what this place remembers, to the violence and sorrow that soaked into the bedrock itself? The photos on my phone suggest something impossible, that I didn't just hallucinate those figures, that I actually saw them, that the water made me visible to the past and made the past visible to me. I'm going to let the doctors treat me, going to take whatever medications they prescribe, going to follow every protocol for recovery from mineral poisoning. But I'm also going to research what I saw, going to find historical records from the Burton settlement, going to check if the people I saw in my visions match actual historical accounts from 1720, and if they do match, if the small boy and the grieving man and the angry settlers correspond to real people who really lived and died here, then I'm going to have to accept something that terrifies me more than any hallucination, that some places remember what happened to them, that some water carries more than just minerals, that Chief Chocorua's dying curse worked exactly as intended because the chemistry and the magic were always the same thing. The White Mountains don't forgive, and they don't forget. And now neither will I, because that water showed me something true, even if the truth is stranger and darker than any folklore or geology textbook could explain. I need to tell someone what happened at Mizpah Spring Hut before we go back tomorrow, before my partner convinces me it was nothing, before I start doubting what I heard in those woods. You need to understand that I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or gets spooked by campfire stories. I'm a database administrator from Portland. I troubleshoot server errors for a living. I deal in logic and data and things that can be verified. But logic doesn't explain what I recorded on my phone 2 nights ago. And data can't account for why that recording terrifies me more than anything I've ever experienced. We'd been planning this White Mountains trip for months, my partner and I, our first real hiking vacation together. And Mizpah Spring Hut seemed perfect. One of those Appalachian Mountain Club huts where you sleep in bunks with other hikers, share meals, swap trail stories. Cozy and communal and safe, or at least that's what I thought before the caretaker told us about Betsy during dinner. The story seemed harmless enough at first, the kind of local legend every mountain hut probably has. A young woman named Betsy, who supposedly drowned in the spring near the hut sometime in the early 1900s, and now hikers occasionally report hearing water sounds at night. Splashing, gurgling, sometimes what sounds like someone gasping for breath. The caretaker told it well, I'll give him that. Made it atmospheric without being too dramatic, and the other hikers around the dinner table seemed charmed by it. That pleasant shiver you get from a ghost story when you're somewhere remote and the wind is picking up outside. My partner squeezed my hand under the table, grinning like this was all part of the adventure, and I smiled back because it was sweet and silly, and we were happy. I didn't believe a word of it, filed it away as folklore designed to add mystique to the hut experience, and went to bed thinking about tomorrow's hike to Mount Pierce. But I couldn't sleep. The bunk room was crowded with 8 other hikers, all of them snoring or shifting in their sleeping bags, and the air felt close and warm despite the October chill outside. Around midnight, I gave up trying to fall asleep and just lay there listening to the sounds of the hut. Creaking wood, wind against the walls, the rhythmic breathing of strangers. That's when I heard it for the first time, so faint I almost missed it beneath all the other sounds. Water moving somewhere outside, a splashing sound that seemed to come from the direction of the spring, rhythmic and deliberate like someone was thrashing in shallow water. I told myself it was just the natural flow of the spring, maybe wind creating ripples, nothing worth investigating, but the sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, and then stopped abruptly, leaving just wind and snoring and the pounding of my own heart. I lay there for another 20 minutes trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, and then I heard something worse. A voice, distant but distinct, calling out words I couldn't quite make out. A woman's voice, high and panicked, and it was coming from the same direction as the splashing sounds. Every rational part of my brain said, stay in your bunk. Don't be the idiot in a horror movie who investigates strange noises. Wake your partner if you're really concerned. But curiosity won, or maybe it was that database administrator part of me that needs to verify anomalies, needs to find the logical explanation. I slipped out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, grabbed my phone for the flashlight, and made my way through the dark bunk room toward the hut's main door. The night outside was clear and cold, the moon bright enough that I barely needed my flashlight. I stood on the hut's porch for a moment, listening, and heard nothing except wind through the trees and the normal sounds of a forest at night. I felt foolish standing there, in my thermal underwear and hiking boots, chasing sounds that had probably been my imagination or some animal near the spring. I was about to go back inside when I heard the voice again, much clearer this time, and I swear to you it was calling a name, my partner's name, spoken with desperate urgency, like someone drowning and crying out for help. The sound froze me in place, made every hair on my body stand up, because the voice was familiar in a way I couldn't place, like hearing a recording of yourself and not quite recognizing it. I started walking toward the spring without really deciding to, following a narrow trail that led away from the hut toward where the caretaker said the water source was located. My phone was in my hand, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and I could hear my own breathing too loud in the quiet. The splashing sounds grew louder as I got closer, violent thrashing like someone fighting against water. And under that, the voice kept calling that name, kept screaming for help in a tone that made my chest tight with sympathetic panic. I reached the spring area, just a small pool fed by underground water, maybe 10 feet across, surrounded by rocks and ferns, and the sound stopped instantly. Complete silence, not even wind, like someone had muted the entire forest. The spring's surface was perfectly still, reflecting moonlight like glass. No ripples or disturbance of any kind. I stood there for maybe a minute, feeling my heart hammering, trying to understand what I'd heard and where it had gone. That's when I thought to check my phone and realized I'd been recording the whole time. I must have accidentally activated the voice memo app when I grabbed the phone for its flashlight. My hands were shaking as I stopped the recording and looked at the file. 4 minutes and 37 seconds of audio captured. I should have waited until morning to listen to it. Should have gone back to the warm hut and my sleeping partner and dismissed the whole thing as a weird auditory illusion. Instead, I pressed play right there beside the spring, volume turned low, and listened to what my phone had captured. The first 2 minutes were just footsteps and breathing. My footsteps, my breathing, moving through the forest. Then, clear and unmistakable in the recording, the splashing sounds began, exactly as I'd heard them. But in the recording, they were louder, more violent, accompanied by this horrible choking noise like someone drowning in shallow water. And then the voice started calling out, and I felt my legs go weak because I recognized it now, understood why it had sounded so familiar. It was my voice, my exact voice, my speech patterns, my intonation, screaming my partner's name over and over with increasing desperation. I was listening to a recording of myself, drowning and calling for help, except I was standing safely on the bank holding the phone, and the version of me in the recording was dying in water that showed no signs of disturbance. I played it again, had to verify what I was hearing, and this time I caught details I'd missed before. In the background of the drowning sounds, beneath my own voice, screaming for help, there was another voice, fainter, older, also calling out a name I didn't recognize. And beneath that, maybe another voice, and another, layers of drowning people calling for help across what might have been decades or centuries, all of their voices overlapping in the same 4 minutes of audio. The recording ended exactly when I reached the spring's edge, exactly when the sounds had stopped in real time, and the last thing captured before silence was my own voice, the me in the recording saying, "It's too late," in this flat, defeated tone before. The water sounds cut off completely. I ran back to the hut. I don't remember making the decision to run, just suddenly finding myself sprinting up the trail, phone clutched in my hand, that recorded voice echoing in my head. I burst through the hut door loud enough to wake several hikers, stumbled into the bunk room, and found my partner sitting up in bed looking concerned and confused. I tried to explain what I'd heard, what I'd recorded, but I was talking too fast and none of it was making sense. They calmed me down, held me while I shook, asked to hear the recording. I played it for them right there in the dark bunk room, volume barely above a whisper, and watched their face change as they listened to my voice drowning in that spring. We left the next morning without finishing our planned hiking route. My partner wanted to leave immediately, but I insisted on talking to the caretaker first. Needed to know if anyone else had experienced this, if there was any history that might explain what I'd recorded. He listened to the audio file with this expression I couldn't read, something between concern and recognition, and then told us about the others. 7 people over the last 15 years who'd reported hearing the spring sounds, and 3 of those people had made recordings. Each recording captured the voice of the person holding the phone. Their own voice, drowning and calling for help in water that remained perfectly still. 2 of those people never came back to the hut. One came back every year, drawn by something she couldn't explain, and the caretaker said she seemed different each time, more distant, like part of her was still at the spring listening to that recording. Here's the part that made us leave, the detail that's kept me awake every night since we got home. The caretaker pulled up a database of hut incident reports, showed us entries going back to 1985, and we found her, the original Betsy from the legend. Except she wasn't from the early 1900s and she didn't drown. She was a hiker in 1985 who stayed at Mizpah Spring Hut and reported hearing drowning sounds from the spring. She made a recording on her cassette tape recorder, heard her own voice calling for help, and became obsessed with understanding it. She kept coming back to the hut, kept going to the spring at night, kept playing that recording over and over. In 1987, she went to the spring one night and never came back. They found her 3 days later in the water, drowned in a pool that was only 18 inches deep at its deepest point. Drowned in a way the medical examiner couldn't explain because there was no sign of injury or intoxication or any reason she wouldn't have simply stood up. We're supposed to go back tomorrow. My partner thinks I'm insane. But I can't stop listening to the recording, can't stop hearing my own voice, calling out for help from a death that hasn't happened yet. The hut called 2 days ago. Not the caretaker, but someone from the main AMC office, asking if we'd be interested in participating in a study about the Mizpah phenomenon, saying they've been documenting cases for years, and mine was particularly clear. I told them I'd think about it, but I already know I'm going back. I have to understand what that recording means, why the spring shows some people their own future drowning, what Betsy found in those waters that she couldn't walk away from. My partner is packing a bag right now, thinks they can convince me not to go, but I can hear it in their voice too. That same pulled feeling, the need to return to the spring and understand. The recording plays in my head constantly now, my own voice screaming for help, and I'm starting to wonder if the drowning already happened, if what I think of as my life now is just the echo of someone who died at Mizpah Spring years ago and doesn't know it yet, still playing out the motions of living while the water waits patiently for me to come back and finish what the recording already captured. Day 14 of winter, caretaking rotation, protocols maintained, mental state acceptable. That's what I wrote in the log. I was already lying. Jim Liberty Cabin sits on the Flume slide trail at 3,800 feet, and for 2 months every winter, the AMC stations someone there to maintain the structure and assist the occasional winter hiker brave enough or foolish enough to trek this far in February. I applied for the position because I wanted solitude, wanted to prove something to myself after a year of noise and chaos and too many people demanding too much. I'm 26 years old, and I thought I knew what silence was, thought I understood what it meant to be alone. The cabin taught me I was wrong about both things. The first week was fine. Better than fine, actually. It was everything I'd hoped for. I had my routines, my checklists, my scheduled radio contacts with base camp every evening. The cabin is small but well maintained. One main room with a wood stove, a loft for sleeping, shelves stocked with emergency supplies. I spent my days splitting wood, checking the structure for ice damage, maintaining the trail markers within a half-mile radius. At night, I read by headlamp, wrote in my journal, listened to downloaded podcasts on my phone. The silence felt peaceful, contemplative, exactly what I'd been craving. I remember writing to a friend during the week one that this was the best decision I'd ever made, that the quiet was healing something inside me I hadn't known was broken. I should have paid more attention to why I needed to keep describing the silence, why I kept mentioning it in every journal entry like I was trying to convince myself it was normal. Week 2 is when I started noticing the acoustic properties. I dropped a metal pot one morning and the sound was wrong, flat, dead, like the clang was absorbed by the air itself before it could properly echo. I tested it deliberately, after that clapping my hands, shouting, banging on different surfaces, and every sound died too quickly, swallowed by something I couldn't identify. Outside wasn't much better. The forest around Jim Liberty is dense with conifers, which explains some sound dampening, but this was beyond normal. I could snap a branch 10 feet away and hear it as clearly as if it happened beside me. But my own voice calling out seemed to vanish 3 feet from my mouth. I'm not a sound engineer, don't have the technical vocabulary to describe what was happening, but I knew it was wrong. I mentioned it during my evening radio check, tried to make it sound casual, and the coordinator at base camp said something about winter conditions affecting acoustics, about cold air and snow cover changing how sound travels. It made sense, or enough sense that I accepted it, but I'd already started filling the silence with noise. I began talking to myself constantly, not just thinking out loud while doing chores, but actual conversations, narrating everything I did, like I was hosting a documentary about winter cabin life. I played music from my phone, not loud but continuous, a steady background presence. At night, I left podcasts running while I tried to sleep, needed voices in the darkness, even though I'd come here specifically to escape voices. I told myself it was normal, that anyone alone for this long would need some auditory stimulation, but the truth was darker, and I knew it. The silence in Jim Liberty cabin wasn't just absence of sound. It was something active, something that pressed against my eardrums and made the inside of my head feel too loud by contrast. In true quiet, you become aware of your own body's sounds, heartbeat, breathing, blood moving through vessels near your ears, the small wet noises of blinking and swallowing. But this silence magnified all of that, made my body's sounds deafening, made me hyper-aware of every biological process happening inside me. It was like being trapped inside myself with no escape, and the music and talking were desperate attempts to break out. By day 17, I was hearing things that weren't there. Voices in the white noise of the wind, footsteps on the cabin's porch that vanished when I checked, knocking sounds from the walls that I convinced myself were just the wood contracting in the cold. I knew these were auditory hallucinations, knew that sensory deprivation could cause the brain to generate false stimuli to compensate for lack of input. I'd read about this before applying for the position, had thought I was prepared for it, had believed that understanding the mechanism would protect me from it. I was wrong. Knowing why you're hallucinating doesn't make the hallucinations less convincing, doesn't make them easier to ignore, doesn't stop them from feeling absolutely real in the moment they occur. Day 20, and I found the messages. I was inventorying the emergency supplies, something to do with my hands, something to focus on besides the screaming silence and my own breathing, when I discovered papers tucked behind the first aid kit. Journal pages, torn out and folded small, written in handwriting that wasn't mine. The first one said, "It's not haunted. I know what you're thinking, but it's not ghosts. It's the location. Something about how the mountain slopes and the tree density creates an acoustic dead zone. Sound doesn't travel right. You'll start hearing things soon. The less you hear from outside, the more you'll hear from inside your own head. Don't trust it." The second note was more frantic. Day 34, and I can hear my thoughts like someone speaking them out loud. Is that normal? When does thinking become hearing? How do you know the difference? The silence makes everything internal feel external. I don't know what's me anymore. The third note was just one sentence, written over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting. The cabin is breathing with me. The cabin is breathing with me. The cabin is breathing with me. I should have called for extraction right then. Should have radioed base camp and said I needed to come down early, mental health reasons, whatever excuse would get me off this mountain. Instead, I researched. I spent 6 hours on my laptop, burning through battery, reading everything I could find about acoustic dead zones and their psychological effects. There are places on Earth where terrain and atmospheric conditions create areas of severe sound dampening. Some acoustic dead zones have been documented in caves, in certain valleys, in specific architectural spaces. The human brain requires a certain level of ambient sound to function normally. When that drops below a threshold, the auditory processing system starts malfunctioning, generating phantom sounds to fill the void. Prolonged exposure can cause anxiety, paranoia, dissociation, complete psychological breakdown. The previous caretaker hadn't been crazy or experiencing anything supernatural. They'd been suffering from a documented neurological response to an environmental condition. Knowing this should have helped. It didn't, because understanding the science doesn't change the experience. Knowing that my brain was misfiring, that the voices and sounds were internally generated, didn't make them stop. If anything, it made it worse, because now I was hyper-aware of every sound and constantly questioning whether it was real or hallucinated. Was that wind, or was it my brain filling in expected sounds? Was that footstep real or imagined? Am I talking out loud right now, or just thinking I'm talking? The line between external and internal audio kept blurring, and the more I tried to maintain it, the faster it dissolved. By day 23, I was sleeping maybe 2 hours a night, keeping music playing constantly, talking to myself in continuous stream of consciousness narration just to have something to focus on besides the silence and my own spiraling thoughts. Day 25 is mostly blank in my memory. I know I completed my morning protocols because I found the checklist marked off later, but I don't remember doing any of it. I know I missed my evening radio check because base camp called me twice, and I have the notifications on my radio, but I don't remember hearing it ring. What I do remember is sitting in the middle of the cabin floor, no music playing, no talking, just sitting in the silence and listening to what I can only describe as the cabin breathing. Slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, the wood creaking in time with my own respirations, the air pressure changing in sync with my lungs. I sat there for hours. Must have been hours based on how the light changed, just breathing with the cabin, unable to tell where my breath ended and the building's movements began. It felt like we were one organism, like I'd merged with the structure, like the silence had dissolved the boundaries between me and everything else. They found me on day 31. I'd missed 4 consecutive radio checks, and a winter storm made immediate extraction impossible, so it took them 6 days to reach the cabin. Apparently, I'd been writing in my journal the entire time. They showed me later, pages and pages of increasingly incoherent entries about silence and breathing, and the boundaries of self. I don't remember writing any of it. I barely remembered those 6 days at all, just fragments, sitting in the dark because I'd stopped bothering with the headlamp. The absolute conviction that the cabin was alive, and I was inside something's lungs. The growing certainty that sound itself was a lie and silence was the only truth. The rescue team said I was responsive but distant, that I answered questions in monotone, that I kept asking them if they could hear the cabin breathing. I'm back in the valley now, been back for 3 weeks, seeing a therapist who specializes in isolation trauma. She says what I experienced was severe sensory deprivation psychosis, that the acoustic properties of Jim Liberty's location created a perfect storm of conditions for psychological breakdown, that I'm not crazy and I'm not haunted, and my brain will recover. She's probably right. The hallucinations have stopped. My sleep is improving. I can handle normal, ambient sound again without panic. But here's what I can't explain to her. What I can't explain to anyone who wasn't in that cabin. The silence wasn't just absence. It was presence. It was something that existed, something that had weight and texture and intention. The breathing wasn't a hallucination. It was me finally hearing what was always there, finally perceiving something that exists just outside normal human sensory range. They want to send someone else to Jim Liberty next winter, and I told them they shouldn't. Told them the cabin needs to be permanently closed, that the acoustic conditions make it psychologically dangerous, that no amount of preparation or understanding can protect you from what happens in that silence. But they think I'm just traumatized, think I need more time to process the experience before I can be objective about it. Maybe they're right. Maybe in 6 months, I'll agree that it was just my brain misfiring, just natural phenomena I misinterpreted, just the predictable result of prolonged isolation in adverse conditions. But right now, 3 weeks out and sleeping in a house full of people and normal sounds, I still wake up sometimes in the dead of night and hold my breath, listening for the cabin breathing back. You know how some people talk about the White Mountains like they're beautiful but heavy, like the air itself remembers what's happened there. I never understood that until the night I watched 3 dead children try to save my life on Route 302. I'm telling you this the same way I told my crew afterward. Quiet, straight, no drama. Because if you ever find yourself driving through Crawford Notch in the dark, I want you to recognize what you're seeing before you make the mistake I almost did. I've been a road maintenance supervisor for the state for just over 20 years. I've seen drunks flip their cars on black ice, tourists slide into guardrails, rockfall the size of refrigerators come down without warning. You do this long enough, you stop romanticizing the mountains. They're not majestic or magical when you're out here at 3 a.m. in January trying to keep people from dying. They're indifferent, that's what they are. They don't care if your kid's in the back seat or if you've saved up all year for a foliage trip. Weather comes, rock moves, snow slides, and if you're in its way, you're done. Simple as that. That's how I thought of the Notch, until the kids started showing up. The night I'm talking about wasn't during a storm, which is part of why it rattled me so badly. It was one of those weird, unseasonably warm, late fall nights when you feel like winter's standing just out of sight watching. The sky was low and colorless, and a damp mist hung in the air. Not quite fog, but enough to blur the tree line into gray shapes. My crew and I had been assigned an overnight run through Crawford Notch to inspect a stretch of guardrail that had taken a beating from a couple of minor rockfalls. We were staging out of the small pull-off not far from the Willie House site. If you know the story, you know the place. If you don't, all you need to know is a whole family tried to escape a landslide there in 1826 and ended up running straight into their own deaths while the house behind them survived untouched. The kind of story that sticks to a landscape. We'd been out there for hours already. The light from the portable work lamps turned the mist into this bright, swirling soup, and everything beyond the edge of that artificial daylight felt far away and unreal. My guys were swapping out twisted rail sections while I walked the line, checking for undercut spots and loose scree on the slope above. The forest was quiet in that way it gets at night in the shoulder seasons. No insects buzzing, just the occasional drip of water from branches and the distant rush of the Saco down in the dark. It was the kind of silence that makes your own footsteps sound too loud. I saw them first, from maybe 40 yards away. 2 small shapes standing on the narrow gravel shoulder, where the work lamps didn't quite reach, just inside that murky gray zone where it's never fully dark, but never clear either. At first, I thought it was some hikers who decided to road walk a segment and ended up wandering into our closure zone. I lifted my hand automatically to signal them to stay put, already mentally rehearsing the "this section's closed, folks, you'll need to detour" speech. But even as my hand went up, something in the back of my mind was already saying, no, that's not what you're looking at. They were too still. That's what hit me first. Kids, even cold, tired kids, don't stand perfectly motionless on the side of an active work zone. They bounce on their heels, shift from foot to foot, tug on sleeves, stare at the trucks. These two just stood, side by side, completely still. No flicker of reflective material on their clothes, no headlamp, no modern gear. As I walked closer, my boots crunching on sand and salt, the air seemed to get heavier, like I was walking into a room where someone had just said something terrible, and the echo was still hanging there. By the time I was close enough to see them clearly, my mouth had gone dry. They were children. That much was obvious. One a little taller, maybe 11 or 12, the other younger, small enough that the two long sleeves of a rough-looking shirt half covered their hands. They were dressed in clothes that didn't belong on that road in that year. Thin, pale fabric shirts, old-style trousers and skirts, boots that looked like something out of a museum. You know how you can tell the difference between old but practical and costume? These weren't costumes. Their clothes had that slumped, worn-in look of things that have been used, mended, and used again until the fibers themselves look tired. I stopped about 10 feet from them and raised my flashlight, angling the beam down so I wouldn't blind them. "Hey," I called, trying to keep my voice steady, to sound like a guy in charge of a worksite, and not someone whose instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. "What are you doing out here? Where are your folks?" They didn't answer. They didn't even look at me at first. Both of them were staring upslope, toward the looming dark mass of the mountain that rose above the road. If you've never stood there at night, you can't quite picture it, the way that wall of rock and trees just looms, like an ocean wave that froze right before it crashed. That's where their attention was, fixed and unblinking. I took another step forward, slow. "You can't be this close to the road, okay? It's not safe. Look at me for a sec. You hurt. You lost." The smaller one turned first. The movement was slow, almost stiff. When their face came into view, something in my chest clenched. Not because they were monstrous or disfigured. They weren't. They looked like a regular kid, thin and pale, hair slicked down in an old-fashioned style. But their eyes, there was something ancient in that expression, something that didn't belong on a child's face. It wasn't malice, it was tired sorrow, a kind of deep, settled sadness, like this little person had been watching people make the same mistake for a very long time. The older one finally turned too, and that broke whatever spell had my feet glued in place. I took a breath, opened my mouth to tell them we'd help them find their parents, and that's when the older one raised an arm and pointed. Not at me, not down the road, but straight up the slope. The gesture was sharp and precise, not a vague, "Look over there," but a clear, "Right there." Their hand didn't wobble. They pointed to a patch of darkness where the worklight glare faded out, to a spot on the mountain where, as far as I could see, there was nothing but trees and rock and shadow. I remember every sensation in my body at that moment. The cold wetness of the mist on my cheeks, the weight of the reflective vest on my shoulders, the smell of diesel from the idling truck, the way the hairs on my arms rose under my jacket without any breeze. I followed that small, pale finger and stared up into the dark until my eyes watered. But there was nothing special there. No movement, no glint of loose rock, no animal. Just cold, silent slope. "I don't see anything," I said, softer now. The words steamed in the air between us. "What am I looking at, kiddo?" The smaller one finally spoke. The voice that came out didn't sound like it belonged to any particular time. There was no strong accent, nothing theatrical. Just flat, matter-of-fact words spoken too quietly for anyone but me to hear. "It's coming," they said. I swallowed. "What's coming?" "Like before." The older one's mouth barely moved. "When we ran." If you know the Willie story, you know why those words went through me like ice water. A family, awakened by roaring in the night, convinced a slide was coming. They ran from their house to what they thought was safety at the base of a ledge. The house stayed standing, protected by a rocky knoll that split the debris flow. The family and their farm hands were wiped out. Like before when we ran. It hit me all at once where I was standing, what those kids were dressed like, what was buried under this ribbon of asphalt we'd carved through the notch. "Okay," I said too loudly. "Okay, fine." I backed up a step, turned halfway toward my crew, who were still working in the noisy, bright bubble of light around the trucks, oblivious. "We're wrapping it up," I shouted. My voice sounded thin and wrong in my own ears. "Now, Everybody off the rail, tools in the truck. We're done for tonight. There was some grumbling, confusion, one guy yelling back, asking if we weren't going to finish the last section. I didn't answer him. I kept my eyes on the slope where that small hand was pointing, and I felt something then. A shiver through the ground more than a sound, like a deep, far-off rumble that's too low for your ears, but not for your bones. The kids both looked sharply at me, and for the first time there was something like urgency in their faces. "Move it," I barked, authority snapping back into my voice like a whip. "Drop what you're doing and get in the damn trucks. Now." There's a tone you develop in this line of work, the one that says, this is not up for debate. The clanging and banging around the guardrail stopped. I heard steel hit pavement, boots pounding. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see my crew jogging toward the vehicles, still confused but obeying. I turned back to the children to tell them to come with us, to get them away from the shoulder, and they weren't there. They didn't fade. They didn't walk away. 1 second they were in front of me, 2 small figures against the gray, one arm still raised toward the mountain. The next second there was nothing but empty gravel and the faint outline of old snowmelt stains on the stone embankment behind them. The air in front of me seemed to rush in like it was filling the space where they'd been. For a heartbeat, everything went too quiet. Even the trucks behind me seemed muffled, like someone had put hands over my ears. And then I heard it properly, the deep grinding roar that doesn't sound like anything until your body recognizes it. Rock moving where rock shouldn't move. If you've never heard an avalanche or a major slide start, there's no perfect comparison. Imagine a freight train made of boulders and trees, starting very far away and coming very fast. It's not just one sound, but layers. Cracking, snapping, a low rumble, the sharper clatter of smaller debris. The slope above the patch of road we'd been working on seemed to bulge in the dim light, a dark shape shifting against an even darker background, and then it came down. From the time that first low groan reached me to the moment the debris hit the place those kids had been pointing at, maybe 10 seconds passed. Maybe less. My crew barely had time to slam truck doors before the first wave of dirt and rock spilled over the cut above the road and thundered down. The impact shook the ground hard enough that I had to put a hand on the bumper to stay upright. Chunks of stone bounced and spun across the asphalt, exactly where we'd been standing minutes earlier. It wasn't a full slope catastrophe, the kind that wipes out everything in its path, but it was bad enough. The section of guardrail we'd been working on was twisted like a toy. The ditch was completely buried. A few football fields worth of debris piled up across both lanes. If anyone had been under that cut when it let go, there wouldn't have been time to scream. There was a lot of paperwork after that. Reports, geotechnical surveys, meetings about slope stability and early warning systems. The official line, the one that ended up in the incident review, was that I'd called the work early because I felt ground instability and increasing hazard, which in a way was true. That's how I phrased it, because there isn't a box to check for children who died in 1826 pointed upslope, and told me, it's coming. I never told the full story to my superiors. I did, however, go back alone a few weeks later, after the slide had been cleared and the road reopened. It was late afternoon this time. Pale winter sun laying long shadows across the notch. I parked in the same pull-off, walked the same stretch of road, stopped at the exact spot where I'd seen them. There was nothing there now but new guardrail and scarred rock where fresh cuts had been made to stabilize the slope. I stood on the shoulder and looked up the mountain. The new scrape from the slide was obvious, a raw, pale gash through the darker trees and rock. It lined up almost perfectly with where that small hand had been pointing. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, half hoping and half dreading that I'd see those figures again. I never did. Not clearly. But I will tell you this. Sometimes, when I drive through Crawford Notch on a graveyard shift, and the mist is hanging low, and the world feels pressed in close, I catch shapes at the edge of my high beams, small, still silhouettes on the shoulder or up the embankment. If I blink or look straight at them, they're gone. But I always slow down now when I feel that heaviness. Always take an extra look at the slopes. Always listen to that cold prickle that runs up my neck. You can call it stress, or a guilty conscience, or tired brain tying roadside shadows into old stories. Believe whatever helps you sleep. All I know is that 3 of the Willie children's bodies were never found after that slide almost 200 years ago, and that on one foggy night they were there when I needed them most, pointing at the exact place where the mountain was about to move. If you ever find yourself on Route 302 in the dark and you see kids by the roadside where no kids should be, don't ignore them. Don't try to explain it away in that moment. Just slow down. Look where they're looking, because some tragedies don't stop at the date on the marker. They keep trying to warn us not to make the same mistake. You ever have a stranger look at you like they recognize you from a life you're sure you haven't lived yet? Hold on to that feeling for a second, because that's the only way to explain what happened to me between lakes of the Clouds Hut and the summit of Mount Washington. I'm telling you this like we're sitting in the dark together, because if I just lay it out clinical, your brain will file it under odd coincidence and move on. And this is not something you move on from. This is something that sits behind your eyes every time you lace up your boots and step onto a trail. I was doing what a lot of hikers do in the presidentials, pushing my luck with a shoulder season traverse. Late October, that gray zone where the calendar says fall but the mountain has already decided it's winter. I'd overnighted at Lakes of the Clouds Hut on one of the last operating weekends, planning to tag the summit in the morning and then drop down before the weather turned. You know how it is up there. Clouds right at eye level, sky and ground made of the same cold white, cairns like ghosts spaced along the trail. That morning, though, it seemed almost gentle. Light wind, visibility maybe a couple 100 yards, that deceptive kind of calm you get right before the summit reminds you who's in charge. The hut was thinning out for the season, skeleton crew, maybe half a dozen hikers including me. Breakfast was the usual mix of oatmeal, coffee, and nervous weather talk. I remember one of the crew members mentioning storms later in the afternoon, and the phrase stuck with me. If you're not below tree line by 2, you're decorating the mountain. I laughed because that's what you do to keep the tension off, but I checked my watch 3 times on the way out the door. The first time I saw him, it barely registered. Just another figure ahead of me on the Crawford path, backpack moving steadily, boots sure on the rock. He had this old-school setup, wool pants, faded jacket, frame pack that had seen a lot of years. From behind, I clocked him as one of those old-timers who've been hiking these peaks since before I was born. The kind who can tell you what the huts looked like before renovations and how deep the snow was in '78. I didn't hurry to catch up. Part of me liked having another human shape up there in the cloud, proof I wasn't completely alone in that gray nowhere. But the distance between us didn't change. I've paced enough to know when I'm matching someone without meaning to, and we were locked at exactly the same speed. Every time I stopped to adjust a strap or snap a photo of the cairns fading into the mist, I'd set off again, and there he'd be, not closer, not farther, just this constant half-seen figure ahead. It was near one of the bigger cairns, maybe a quarter mile below the summit cone, that everything slipped. One second I had wet rock under my boots. The next I had this yawning sideways sensation, like stepping between 2 elevator cars that just started moving in different directions. No warning, no vertigo buildup, just a full-body lurch. I dropped to a crouch on instinct, palms scraping on cold stone, breathing hard. The world went very quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. When I lifted my head, the cairns were gone. The trail was still there under my hands, boulders, gravel, lichen. But the neat human stacks that had been guiding me up the mountain weren't where they should be. The sky looked wrong, too. Not whited-out cloud anymore, but a washed-out blue with thin, high streaks of cirrus. The light had changed angle, like hours had passed in a blink. And the figure with the old frame pack. He wasn't ahead of me anymore. He was standing 10 feet away, facing me. You know how your mind does that rapid inventory when something is off? Clothes, age, posture, expression, all of it gets scanned in a heartbeat. That's when the first real crack opened in my sense of reality, because up close, nothing about him matched the year I'd woken up in that morning. His jacket was faded canvas with patched elbows, the kind sold in army surplus stores decades ago. His boots were heavy leather, the kind you have to grease, with stitching that screamed pre-Gore-Tex. The frame pack on his back was aluminum, scuffed and dented, with a brand logo I faintly recognized from old photos, not from any gear shop I'd been in. His face was the worst part, and not because it was frightening. It was normal. Weathered, creased at the corners of his eyes, stubble showing gray under a day's growth. But layered under that normal was something else. The same look I'd seen on old portraits hanging in town halls, people frozen in a time they didn't know would pass them by. There was confusion in his eyes, but also this deep, tired resignation. "You made it up," he said, like we were continuing a conversation. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been calling out for a long time. Yeah. My own voice sounded distant in the thin air. "You okay?" He looked past me, squinting at a point just over my shoulder. "You came from the hut. Is it still there?" Something cold moved up my spine. "Lakes of the Clouds. Yeah, couple minutes behind me." He let out a breath that could have been a laugh or a sob. "Still there," he repeated softly. "They still send people up then." It hit me then. The reports I'd read in a bored, late-night deep dive. The story that stuck because of how mundane it sounded. A hiker who'd left Lakes of the Clouds for the summit in the late 70s and never came back. Weather moved in, search crews went out. Nothing. No body, no pack, no sign except a couple of impressions in soft soil that might have been his last steps. You read enough of those incident reports, they blurred together. Until you're standing on the same rock, looking into eyes that shouldn't be able to look back. "What's your date?" he asked suddenly. I stared at him. "My what?" "The date," he said, sharper. "What day did you leave the hut?" I gave it to him. Month, day, year. It felt absurd, like answering a security question for a ghost. As I spoke, the color drained from his face in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced around like the landscape was rearranging itself while he watched. That's not right," he whispered. It was August. There was no snow. I was supposed to be down at Pinkham by nightfall. His eyes locked back onto mine. "How long?" I didn't want to say it. Part of me hoped that if I refused, the strangeness would fold back in on itself, and I'd wake up in my bunk to the sound of someone snoring. But he kept looking at me, and I realized, with a kind of sick clarity, that he already knew. He just needed to hear it. "About 40 years, I said. He closed his eyes. Not dramatically, not like in a movie. Just shut them, like someone does when a migraine crests. When he opened them again, there was no panic there. Just acceptance that went down farther than any rock I'd ever seen. "I lost the cairns," he said quietly. "Fog came in quick. I thought I could cut across, pick them back up higher. I kept hearing voices. Thought they were from the summit house. Kept walking toward them." He huffed a breath. They weren't. We stood there, in a silence that felt crowded. The air around us felt thicker, like there were others listening just outside of sight. The mountain under my boots felt less like solid ground, and more like something watching to see what I'd do next. "You're not real, are you?" I asked before I could stop myself. He smiled a little at that. "I've been asking that question for longer than you've been alive, I think." The wind shifted then, carrying a sound up from below, faint, like a memory of voices from the hut. Pots clanging, someone laughing, a door thudding shut. He turned his head toward it more sharply than I did, like an animal hearing the call of its own kind. "I don't think I'm supposed to be here," he said. "Not here. I keep walking the same stretch. Hut, ridge, summit that never comes. Then back again." Time did something strange inside my head then. I saw him leaving the hut in clear August air, stepping out with a confident stride. I saw myself, years later, shrugging into my pack in the same doorway, breathing the same thin oxygen. 2 tracks on the same loop, offset but overlapping. Lakes of the clouds as a sort of way station, emptying and refilling each year while certain things never left at all. "What do you need?" I asked, surprising myself. "For it to stop." He studied me for a long moment, and I had the unnerving feeling he was looking straight through the layers of my life, weighing things I didn't know were visible. "Tell them I wasn't scared," he said finally. "Tell them I kept going because I thought I was close, not because I was stupid, because I loved it up here." "Tell who?" I asked, though I knew. "Whoever came looking," he said. "Whoever never got to bury anything." A cloud bank rolled in then, fast and low, swallowing the horizon in gray. For a second, the world compressed to a little bubble of visibility around us, like the hut's dining room at night. I blinked stinging moisture from my eyes, and he was gone. Not faded, not walked away. Just there one heartbeat, not there the next. Only the wind remained, and the shape of the rocks, and the distant, unmistakable outline of a cairn exactly where it should be 20 yards ahead. I made the summit. I don't remember much about it, just the relief of structure around me, the sound of doors, the clatter of other people moving. What I do remember is the trip back down to the hut, legs shaking not entirely from the descent. I went straight to the old logbooks after dinner, flipping pages until the name jumped out at me right where I knew it would be. Date, destination, summit, then down to Pinkham. No checkout time recorded. A line of pencil through later entries in a different hand. Did not return. I found an older crew member, one of the lifers, who'd seen more seasons than most of us would. I told them the story, every detail, because once I started speaking it felt like something pressing at my ribs would crack them if I didn't let it out. They listened without interrupting, face unreadable. When I finished, they nodded slowly, like I'd just joined some secret, exhausted club. "You're not the first one to meet someone who doesn't sign out," they said softly. "You won't be the last." "Does it help?" I asked. "Telling it?" They shrugged. Maybe not them. Then they looked at me, eyes steady. "But it might help you leave when it's time." I think about that now whenever people ask why I go solo less often. Why I bail on summits when the weather looks even halfway wrong. The mountains are full of things that never quite made it off them. Not just bodies, loops of intention, of love, of stubborn will. Whatever I met up there between Lakes of the Clouds and the summit felt less like a ghost story, and more like catching up to someone stuck in a moment that wouldn't end. If you ever find yourself in that cloud above the hut, and you see a figure with an old frame pack walking just ahead of you, never getting closer, don't chase them. Don't follow the voice that sounds like it's coming from a time when the trail was different. Keep your eyes on the cairns, on the paint, on the very present rock under your boots. And if, by some crack in whatever passes for reality up there, you do end up face to face with someone who never signed out, listen to what they ask you to carry down. Because sometimes the only way those stories leave the ridge is through the next person who survives it. If you were sitting across from me right now with a mug of something warm between your hands, I'd start this by asking you a question. Have you ever answered a call you knew, in your bones, you should have ignored? Not spam, not a drunk ex, something deeper. A voice that sounds like your job, your duty, your pride, all braided together. That's what a Huntington Ravine call is like for a search and rescue tech. It doesn't matter what you're doing, how bad the weather looks. You hear "fallen climber in Huntington" over the radio, and your body's already moving before your brain catches up. That's the pull that put me on that ravine wall the night everything I believed about death and time came apart. I've been with a volunteer search and rescue team in the Whites for years. You learn quickly that Huntington Ravine on Mount Washington is not like other places on this mountain. The trail isn't really a trail, it's a climb, a steep, unforgiving chute of rock and ice, even in good conditions. People slip there and don't stop until the mountain decides they're done. We're trained to be clinical about it. Mechanism of injury, time since fall, vitals, extraction options. You don't make it personal or you won't last a season. I thought I'd gotten good at that. Thought I had healthy distance. Huntington stripped that away in one night. The call came in just after dusk, in January. I was finishing dinner, boots off, radio charging, when the tone hit. That sharp, percussive alert that flips your stomach before you even process the words. Climber fall, Huntington Ravine, Central Gully, possible multiple traumas. Subject conscious, requesting immediate assistance. I remember looking at the clock, 6:12 p.m. Remember the specific time because I wrote it in my incident notes later, and then stared at it for hours, trying to make it line up with what came after. We staged at Pinkham Notch as usual, the familiar controlled chaos of winter rescue kicking into gear. Packs loaded with technical gear, litters, oxygen, hypothermia kit, radios checked, ropes coiled, everyone running through the practice dance of what, up here, passes for organized response in a place that doesn't care about your protocols. While we moved, the radio on the command table was alive with the subject's voice. That part was odd right away. Usually we get spotty communication at best from Huntington, but there he was, clear as if he were in the next room, giving us his location, describing his injuries, cracking grim jokes like he was trying to make us feel better. "I'm in Central," he said, voice tight but coherent. "Above the fan, maybe a body length off the main runout. Took a slide. Legs broken for sure. Maybe some ribs. Anchor's good. I'm not going anywhere." The weather was turning even as we listened. You can hear it in someone's voice when the wind picks up, the way they start to lean words against gusts. We calculated our time. Approach to the ravine, ascent, patient contact, packaging, descent. It was going to be a long, brutal night, but I'd heard enough falls over the years to know when someone had a fighting shot. He did. He was oriented, could report pain, could manage his own anchor. We'd pulled people out of worse. The hike in was the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache when you breathe. Headlamps carved tunnels through blowing snow, the beam catching ice crystals in a way that made the world feel like it was suspended, not quite solid. Underneath the wind, we could still hear his updates whenever command checked in. "I'm okay. Hurts like hell, but I'm okay. I can see your lights down there. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." That last line again, like a refrain. The approach to the base of Huntington is always humbling. The ravine looms overhead like the inside of a frozen wave, shadow swallowing the upper walls. We roped up at the fan, that broad apron of snow and debris at the base of the gullies, and started the slow, methodical climb toward where he said he was anchored. Every placement of crampons and tools was deliberate. Above us, the dark mouth of Central Gully yawned like a throat. We heard him before we saw him. Not with our ears, through the radio. "I can see you," he said. "You're almost here. Couple more pitches." I remember looking up at the wall of snow and ice and rock and seeing nothing but darkness 3 headlamp beams couldn't push through. "We don't have eyes on you yet," I answered. "Can you flash a light?" There was a pause. "Broke in the fall," he said. "But you're close. I can hear you. I'm just above a rock outcrop. You'll hit it in about 10 minutes. Snow blew across my face, fine as dust. My fingertips were going numb, even inside my gloves. The ravine felt alive around us, creaks and pops, and the deep, occasional thud of settling snow. Normal winter noises. Background threats you file away and try not to flinch at. We climbed. Somewhere around the time we should have been near his position, the radio went quiet, not dead, no static, but still. We all noticed it. On a climb like that, in that cold, even the most talkative subject starts to fade. Hypothermia steals speech early. We called his name. No answer. We kept moving. I saw the shape of him in my periphery first, a darker lump against the white. Then my headlamp swept directly over him, and the world narrowed to that one small, brutal fact. He was not anchored. He was crumpled against the rock outcrop like a rag doll, helmet askew, rope limp and slack across his body, half buried in spindrift. Even before I got close enough to see his face, my brain did the math. The angle of the legs, the way his chest wasn't rising, the unnatural stillness that doesn't happen when someone's just unconscious. They always move a little, some small reflex. This was absence. I don't remember the first words out of my mouth, probably the same ones I've used too many times. Subject non-responsive, beginning assessment, clinical, automatic. You focus on tasks, check airway, check breathing, check carotid. Gloved fingers against neck, trying to feel a pulse through your own adrenaline. There was nothing. His skin, where exposed, was already taking on that waxy, too smooth look the living never have. I lifted my head to meet the eyes of the teammate across from me, and we didn't need to say it out loud. He'd been gone a while. I checked my watch. 10:03 p.m. The radio on my shoulder crackled. Command's voice, asking for an update. Beside it, clipped to his harness, was his own radio. The little green LED was still blinking. I could see it in my peripheral vision every time I moved my headlamp. Command. This is field team, I said. We've made contact with the subject. My throat tightened on the next words, but training pushed them out. He's DOA, no signs of life, significant trauma, estimated time of death. I trailed off. How long had he been like this? 10 minutes? An hour? Hypothermia can blur the line. We weren't equipped for wishful thinking, though. We called it as best we could based on signs, rigor, temperature, injuries. They acknowledged, voice somber. They told us to secure the scene, package the body for descent when we were ready. That's when one of my teammates, the quietest guy on the crew, cleared his throat. "Hey," he said softly. "Listen." At first, over the wind, I heard nothing. Then faintly from a speaker that was not mine came a sound I knew too well by then. His voice, the subject's voice. Tinny threw the cheap radio speaker clipped to his dead harness. "Command, this is the name he'd given us, the one we'd used all night. They almost here? I'm getting cold up here." I froze. Every muscle in my body turned to stone. The dead man's radio, attached to the dead man's chest, broadcasting words in the present tense. The LED blinked in lazy green rhythm. For a moment, I actually thought, wild and giddy, that we'd made a mistake, that he was alive after all, that hypothermia had tricked us, and this was some miraculous revival. I bent closer, hand hovering over his mouth, willing to feel breath. There was none. The voice kept talking, oblivious to the gloved hand in front of lifeless lips. "Tell them I'm at the rock outcrop," it said. "I can hear them on the ice. Feels like it's taking forever." A low chuckle. "Not that I'm going anywhere." That same line again. It hit me like a blow. No one said anything for a few seconds. Then my team lead, eyes very wide, reached down and unclipped the radio from the dead harness. He turned it over in his hand, like it might bite him. The transmission continued seamless. Starting to lose feeling in my fingers, the tiny speaker announced in the subject's tone. "You guys close." Command's reply came simultaneously over my own radio. "Affirmative. We have field team with you now." I stared at my watch. 10:07 p.m. Earlier, hiking in, I checked the time when he last responded directly to us. 8:45 p.m. He joked about wanting hot chocolate waiting at Pinkham. Light in his voice, wind at his mic, pain layered under it all, based on his body's state. The medical examiner later pegged his time of death somewhere around 9 p.m., give or take 10 minutes. Or cause, massive internal trauma from the fall. He wouldn't have stayed conscious long. Wouldn't have had the strength or clarity to keep that steady stream of updates going for hours. And yet, we had them, recorded, time-stamped on the command log. His voice, answering questions and asking his own right up until the moment we arrived at a body that had been dead for at least an hour. We got him down. That part is all muscle memory and rope work and cold and the slow grind of gravity. You focus on knots and anchors and footing. It was later, at the debrief, when the weight of it really hit. We sat in a little room that smelled like coffee and wet gear, peeled out of our layers, and listened to the radio traffic from the incident. Someone hit play. The recording unspooled in chunks: initial call, first contact, location updates, jokes about hot chocolate. Not going anywhere. I can see your lights. His last clear message, according to the log, at 9:52 p.m. Feels like you're right below me. I'll leave the porch light on. I remember squeezing my eyes shut at that because I was cinching straps on his litter at 9:52, feeling the dead weight settle, hearing nothing but wind and the creak of nylon. The medical examiner's report sat on the table between us, a neat clinical document that said, in precise language, he had been beyond help before some of those words were spoken. You can do a lot with rationalization if you work at it. We tried. Maybe the radios glitched. Maybe earlier transmissions were delayed and played out of order. Maybe we misheard the times. But the recordings didn't care what made sense. They had their own chronology, stamped in indifferent digital numerals. The part that keeps me up isn't even the voice after death. It's the tone. He wasn't panicking, wasn't bargaining. He sounded lonely, tired. A man in the dark trying to stay awake a little longer because he knew someone was coming, and he didn't want to be rude and not be there when they arrived. He kept us company on our climb, long after his heart had stopped. I don't work Huntington anymore. I still run with the team, still go out in bad weather, still haul litters through snow that comes up to my thighs. But when a call comes in for that ravine, I feel that old pull and something colder layered under it, and I let someone else answer. I help on the radio instead. I log times. I listen to the voices. And every so often, when the wind picks up just right over the speaker, when a subject's breathing crackles through, there's an extra beat. A faint overlay. Like another voice, a half step behind, walking the same gully again and again, stuck between the fall and the rescue that came too late. If you're ever up there and you hear a radio you don't recognize, a voice telling you he can see your lights when you know you're alone on the wall, don't answer him. Not out loud. Do your job. Check your anchors. Watch your team's feet. Make your way down alive. And when someone at the base asks if you heard anything strange, anything that didn't fit, you can say no. Or you can tell them the truth that sometimes, on Huntington Ravine, even the echoes haven't learned they're dead yet. You know that feeling when a place you've run 100 times suddenly doesn't recognize you back, like a familiar trail has shifted half an inch to the left, and your body knows it before your brain does. That's how I want you to sit with me in this story, like you're standing right behind my shoulder as I check my watch at Waternomi Falls and realize 7 hours of my life are missing. Not metaphorically, literally. I'm a trail runner. Not the casual kind, the obsessive kind. Ultramarathons, back-to-back long runs, data spreadsheets of splits and elevation profiles. The White Mountains are my training ground, and the loop out past Waternomi Falls was one of my easy days. I'm telling you that up front so you understand. I know what my body can and can't do. I know what a hard mile feels like versus a hallucination, and I know my gear. My watch, my GPS, my heart rate. Those are my comfort objects. They tell me what's real when everything else starts to blur. The day this happened was one of those deceptively perfect summer mornings. Cool starting out, blue sky with just enough clouds to take the edge off the sun, trailhead lot half full of day hikers and families. I remember the smell, Pine needles warming up, wet earth from rain the night before, a hint of something floral drifting from somewhere I couldn't see. I parked, laced up, did my usual neurotic double check. Water, gels, small first aid kit, phone, watch synced to GPS, route loaded. The plan was simple. A long, steady run, out past the falls, add a small side exploration to connect back, be home before dark with time to ice my knees and log the stats. The first part of the run was exactly what I wanted. My legs felt good, breathing even, that satisfying rhythm of footfalls on packed dirt and rock. The woods were alive in the gentle way they get on a weekday. Enough people around that you catch voices now and then, but long stretches where it's just you, birds, and the low rush of water somewhere off trail. I passed a couple of hikers near the junction to the falls, nodded, traded the usual quick trail small talk. Nothing strange, nothing ominous, just another solid training day. The side path down to Waternomi Falls has always felt different. There's a shift in the air when you take it. Call it temperature, humidity, topography, whatever explanation helps you sleep. The canopy closes in a little tighter. The light goes green and dim, and the sound of the falls starts as a low murmur you feel more in your chest than your ears. I've heard people call it enchanted in that eye-rolling Instagram caption way. The old locals have rougher names for it: fairy grounds, dancing place, a spot where you don't stray off the path if you respect yourself. I took the turn anyway. I always do. It's beautiful down there, and I like finishing the first half of my run with a quick stop at the falls. A ritual. Cold water on the face, a gel, a couple sips, then back to the main trail. Routine is how you make wild places feel manageable. The closer I got to the water, the more the world seemed to narrow. Sounds from the main trail faded. The air cooled sharply, like stepping into a different altitude. My watch buzzed at my wrist. 5 miles, pace steady. I remember glancing at it, seeing the time. 10:18 a.m. I remember that because it was the last normal grounded moment of that day. The falls came into view the way they always do, suddenly. 1 second I was bounding over roots, the next I was stepping onto damp stone, looking at water spilling over rock in a white sheet, mist catching the light in tiny rainbows. There was no one else there, no voices, no discarded snack wrappers, just the water and the rocks and me. Here's where it gets slippery. There isn't one big, and then it all went wrong, moment I can point to. If there was, I could tell myself I slipped, hit my head, had a concussion, dreamed the rest. Instead, what I have is this. I blinked. One normal human blink, eyes closed for a fraction of a second, the way you do 1,000 times an hour. When I opened them, everything had shifted sideways. The water was still there, but the light was different. Thick gold, afternoon instead of thin mid-morning. The temperature had dropped. My skin was clammy inside my shirt, like I'd been sweating for hours longer than made sense. My legs felt leaden, trashed in the way they do at the end of an ultramarathon, not halfway through a training run. And the sound, that was the first thing my brain really latched onto. The falls were louder, yes, but underneath that roar, there were threads of something else. Music. Laughter. A high chiming sound that had no business existing in the middle of the woods. My watch buzzed again. Another mile logged. I lifted my wrist, expecting to see 10:20, maybe 10:25. The screen said 5:31 p.m. I laughed out loud. It came out too sharp. Some part of me registered that nobody laughed back. 7 hours. 7 hours I did not remember. My distance had jumped too. What should have been a neat, even number was way higher. The kind of mileage I planned for weeks in advance. Not something I casually slip into a Tuesday. My heart rate graph was a jagged mess. Spikes and drops that looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. I did what I always do when life feels unreal. Check the data. I pulled up the GPS track on my watch, and saw a line that should not have been possible. I had not gone out and back to the falls, and then continued on my planned loop. According to the satellite breadcrumbs, I had run a sprawling, spiraling mess of a route, vanishing off established trails, cutting across ravines, and through dense sections of forest no sane person would choose to bushwhack alone. The line looped back on itself multiple times, forming shapes that made my head hurt if I stared too long. At one point, it crossed the river where there is no bridge and no safe ford. The more I scrolled, the colder I got. You're probably thinking heat stroke, low blood sugar, dissociation. And I would agree with you if it weren't for what came next. There were photos on my phone I did not remember taking. The first few were almost normal. Tree trunks at odd angles, close-ups of moss, of water on rock, of my own shoes half-cropped at the bottom of the frame. Accidental snaps you get when you're fumbling gear. Then they got stranger. One was taken from ground level, tilted, like the phone had been left lying sideways while I ran past, and a blurred version of my own legs streaked across the side of the image. Another showed the same patch of forest floor, over and over, each shot slightly shifted, as if someone had been walking in slow circles. Clicking the shutter every few seconds, the last three stopped me cold. In all three, I'm in the frame, full body, mid-stride. Face turned slightly away, jaw tight, eyes fixed on something just out of view. They're taken from above, like someone was standing on a rock or hanging from a branch, watching me. And in the second one behind me, half faded into the dappled shade, there are shapes. Not animals. Not other hikers. Human-sized, human-shaped smears of lighter color, almost invisible unless you know to look. Arms lifted, like they're reaching. Heads tilted back in what might be laughter or screaming. In the third photo, they're closer. One of them overlaps my shoulder, like I'd run straight through where it was standing. I don't remember any of it. Not the route, not the photos. Not the feeling of being watched that those images imply. My body remembered, though. My quads were on fire. There were fresh scratches across my shins, little lines of blood drying where branches had raked me. My socks were soaked and faintly sandy, like I'd walked in the river at some point. I stood there by the falls, shivering in the warm air, listening. The music was gone. Or maybe it had never been there, and my brain was grafting explanations onto a gap it couldn't accept. What remained was a ringing in my ears and an animal sense of being somewhere I shouldn't linger. The hike back felt wrong in 1,000 small ways. The landmarks were off by a step or two in my memory. A rock I was sure sat beside the trail was now half on it. The junction sign stood at a slightly different angle. None of it big enough to prove. All of it enough to make my skin crawl. When I passed other people, they gave me that quick up and down look you give someone who's clearly had a day. I checked the time on my car's dashboard when I finally reached the lot. It agreed with my watch. 7 hours, gone. I didn't tell anyone at first. How do you bring that up without sounding like you're begging for attention or help? Hey, funny story. I lost most of a workday in the woods and came back with haunted selfies. I told myself I'd overtrained, that mountain weather had messed with the satellite connection, that some glitch had duplicated and distorted my track. I almost managed to believe it. Then, about a week later, insomnia and curiosity teamed up at 2 in the morning, and I started digging online. Here's the thing about the White Mountains. If you think you're the first person something weird has happened to, you're wrong. It took me all of 10 minutes on obscure forums and local history blogs to find them. Dozens of little accounts scattered across years. People who'd gone down to Waternomi Falls, just for a look, and come back disoriented. Lost time. Watches that didn't match clocks. GPS data that mapped out routes through impossible terrain. One person mentioned dancing lights in the trees. Another talked about hearing songs with no words. An old-timer, posting under a username that sounded half like a joke and half like a warning, called it the fairy dancing ground, and said plainly, if you go off path there, you don't come back the same. if you come back at all. Some of them mentioned photos, too. I wasn't special. I was part of a pattern, a set. That should have scared me away from ever going near the place again. Maybe it would have, if not for one last detail I almost wish I hadn't noticed. In the metadata of those 3 photos where I appear, the timestamp isn't 7 hours apart from when I thought I'd been at the falls. It's precise. Exactly 7 hours, down to the minute, from the first buzz of my watch at 5 miles. Someone wrote, in one of those threads, "They like 7s, for whatever that's worth." Then, more chillingly, "Don't follow the music. Don't fall asleep. And if you lose time, don't go back to get it right. That's how it keeps you." I haven't gone back, not physically. But part of me is still there, looping that impossible track my GPS drew, crossing and recrossing the same patch of forest where the air feels heavy and the sound of water hides stranger things. And on long runs, when the world narrows and my brain slips into that weird meditative space, sometimes I hear it again, faint, behind the steady thump of my footsteps. High, chiming notes with no source. Something just ahead, just out of sight, inviting me to take one step off the trail and see what 7 hours in the fairy ground really buys. If you and I were sharing a booth in some small-town diner right now with the white mountains just a dark shape in the windows, I'd start this story with a question that sounds simple, but isn't. How many times would you have to meet the same stranger before you believed they were dead? Not metaphorically, not in the dead inside way. Actually dead. Because that's what happened to me on the Appalachian Trail through the Whites. I met the same hiker 3 times in 8 days, in places no living person could have hiked between. In that time, and the last time I saw him, I knew what he was, and pretended I didn't. I'm a section hiker, not a through hiker. I do my miles in chunks around work and life, picking off states one at a time. The White Mountains were my prize section, the one I'd been both dreading and training for. Steep, technical, beautiful, brutal. All the usual adjectives people throw around. I'd done my homework. Book time calculations, weather patterns, bailout routes, hut schedules. I had spreadsheets. I had contingency plans for my contingency plans. What I didn't have room for anywhere in my risk assessment was whatever he was. The first time I met him was at Lonesome Lake Hut. It was late afternoon, that sweet golden hour when the lake looks like someone spilled molten metal between the trees. I'd had a rough day. Wet rocks on Kinsman Ridge, legs feeling heavier than they should, pack rubbing in a spot I hadn't taped. I shuffled into the hut's common room, half present, mostly thinking about food and whether my socks would dry overnight. He was at one of the long tables, hunched over a map, with that focused, slightly hunched posture you see on people who have more miles behind them than ahead that day. Tall, lean in the way of someone who's burned every extra calorie over the last 1,000 miles. Sun-faded shirt, duct tape on one shoulder strap, beard grown in uneven and wild. There was a smell about him, sweat, trail dust, a faint tang of old campfire smoke that said through hiker before he ever opened his mouth. We did the usual dance. I dropped my pack with a groan. He looked up, nodded that nod of shared suffering, and we fell into conversation. You northbound or southbound? How far are you going? How were the rocks? The kind of small talk that means nothing and everything when you're both temporarily living in this narrow world of blazes and miles. He told me he was through hiking northbound, closing in on Katahdin. Gave me a trail name I'll keep to myself. Said the whites had been chewing him up, but he kind of loved it. He had that gleam in his eye some long-distance hikers get, like they're running on something deeper than food and water. It's part hunger, part joy, part something harder to name. We ate together that night. He talked about the Smokies, about trail magic in Virginia, about waking up to elk bugling in the gray hour in the south. I listened more than I spoke. There was a comfort in his presence, someone deeper in the journey, someone who made the miles I was struggling with look small. I went to bed thinking, if he can do this from Georgia, I can handle my little section. The second time I saw him, 4 days later, I thought I was losing my mind. I'd pushed hard from Zealand Falls to Galehead, one of those days where you feel like you're climbing more than you're walking. By the time I trudged into Galehead Hut, my knees were singing, and my shoulders felt carved out. I was half distracted by the view of the twins when I stepped into the common room and saw him sitting at a table. Same map spread out, same posture, same duct tape strap. You know how, when you see someone you know in a place you don't expect them, your brain does that quick, unbelieving stutter. That little skip between that looks like and that is. That was me, standing in the doorway, like someone had hit pause on me. He looked up, and for a second, there was a flicker across his face I couldn't read. Surprise, recognition, something like both and neither. Then he smiled, same easy, trail-worn grin. Hey, we shared dinner at Lonesome, right? Yeah, I said slowly, dropping my pack. You made good time. He laughed. You too. Whites or something else, huh? And just like that, we were back in the pattern. Tiny, mundane details that should have smoothed everything over. He asked how the section between the huts had been. I asked about his last few days. He mentioned staying at Guyot campsite, then Zealand. It all sounded plausible, but there was a little worm of unease in my skull that wouldn't stop wriggling. Here's why. I know my pace. I know how long it took me to get from Lonesome to Galehead, because I'd sweated for every foot of gain between. I also knew, roughly, what a through hiker carrying his mileage should be doing. The math didn't work. For him to be at Galehead now, after being at Lonesome when I was, he would have had to either skip entire stretches or move at a pace that would kill most people on White's terrain. Yet there he was, looking tired but not wrecked, with that same air of steady, worn-in endurance. That night at Galehead, the hut crew did their usual talk about leave no trace and the weather. We all half listened. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. There were moments when he seemed to fade, not vanish, not go translucent. Just drift, like his focus would slip sideways and he'd be looking at something past the walls, past all of us, some other version of the room layered over the current one. I told myself I was imagining it. Altitude, fatigue, low blood sugar. Maybe I'd seen him in some YouTube trail doc, and my brain was stitching things together wrong. After all, the trail is full of coincidences. Trail names repeat. Faces blur. Maybe I'd misremembered his timing. That's the thing about weirdness in the woods. Your first instinct is always to minimize it into something your normal life can digest. I didn't see him for a couple of days after that. The trail turned punishing in ways that left little room for thinking about anything except the next step. Climbs that felt vertical, descents that ironed my knees flat, weather that shifted from sun to fog to sideways rain in a single ridge. When I did have mental bandwidth, though, I thought about him, about his route, about whether I'd ask him if I saw him again straight out. Where have you really been? By the time I hit a small shelter north of the hut system, I'd mostly talked myself down. I was tired. People look alike. The whites do things to your sense of time. That night, the shelter was nearly empty. Just me and one other hiker already cocooned in their bag. I did my usual routine: cook, hang bear line, change into dry layers, journal by headlamp. I was half dozing, listening to mice scritching in the leaves, when footsteps crunched outside. A beam of light swept briefly across the shelter ceiling. Someone new was coming in late. I turned my head and watched as a tall, lean figure ducked under the lip and shrugged off a pack with duct tape on the strap. My whole body went cold. He saw me, and this time there was no pretending on either side. The look that passed between us was clean, stripped of the polite layer. We both knew. Not what, not how, but that something had stepped outside the expected. You again, he said softly. It should have been a joke. It wasn't. His voice had an edge of something like relief, resignation. I pushed myself up on one elbow. "You tell me how you got here that fast," I said, "and I'll tell you how I did." He smiled at that, but it didn't reach his eyes. He sank onto the shelter floor opposite me, and for a while, we just listened to the night. The forest out there had a different quality this far from the huts. Wilder, less curated. Trees creaked. Something small rustled in the underbrush. An owl called once, low and mournful. "Do you ever lose track of the days?" he asked finally. "Out here?" I shrugged. "Some. I write them down." "I stopped writing them down after Vermont," he said. "Paper got wet. Pen ran out. I just kept moving. Get up, walk, eat, sleep, repeat. Somewhere after the whites, time blurred." "You're in the whites now," I said. He looked at me in a way that made my skin crawl. Not hostile, just studying, like I was a point on a map he'd hoped to cross again. "Am I?" I don't know what made me do it, but I pulled out my phone. No service, of course, but the photos and offline docs worked fine. I'd saved a few screenshots of old articles about notorious thru-hiker incidents, cautionary tales I'd read more than once. I scrolled to one without thinking and held it out like some twisted mirror. "Is this you?" I asked. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance. A tall, bearded hiker grinning at a trailhead sign down south. The accompanying text, from almost a year ago, told the story. "Loved one doing a northbound through hike. Last seen checking in from the Whites. Never reach Maine. Weather window closed. Search efforts hampered. Assumed lost." He didn't look at the phone, just closed his eyes. His hands, resting on his knees, tightened until the knuckles stood out pale in the dim light. "I thought so," he said quietly. "I thought I must have missed something. Slipped. Fallen. But I kept waking up on trail. Same pack. Same aches. People kept not quite seeing me." The other hiker in the shelter snored once, sharp, then rolled over. They didn't stir for any of this. "How long have you been walking?" I asked. He opened his eyes. They looked tired in a way no mileage explains. "Depends on who you ask, I guess," he said. "For me, a season. For them." He nodded at the phone. "A year, maybe forever." We sat with that for a long moment. My brain wanted to reject it, to shove it back into the box marked fatigue hallucination or stress dream. But there was a solidity to him. He wasn't translucent. He shifted his weight, and the old wood creaked. His breath fogged slightly in the cool night air. If this was a ghost, he hadn't read the rule book. "What do you want?" I asked finally. The question felt crude and too big all at once. He looked past me, toward where the AT continued into darkness. "To finish," he said simply. "To touch the sign. To know it meant something. To stop walking and not start again." I could have told him it didn't work like that. That dead men don't summit Katahdin. That he was stuck in some loop between his last known mile and a peak he'd never reach. But sitting there, alone except for one half-stranger and one sound-asleep stranger, the dark pressing in close, I couldn't do it. Couldn't make my mouth form the cruelty of facts. Instead, I nodded. "Then you should keep going," I said. "You're not that far, if you think about how long you've already been out." He smiled again, and this time there was something like real warmth in it. "You'll get there too," he said. "Maybe not this year, but you will. Just don't follow me if you see me where I shouldn't be, okay?" "What happens if I do?" I asked, even though I didn't want the answer. He tilted his head, considering. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd hate to have company on this particular kind of walk." We fell asleep eventually, or I did. When I woke in the gray sag of pre-dawn, the spot across from me was empty. No imprint on the dust, no extra boot tracks leading away from the shelter. Just my own, heading north. I checked every trail register I passed after that. At first, it was subconscious, then deliberate, flipping pages, scanning for his trail name. I found it once, in a register months old, south of where we'd met, in handwriting that matched what I'd seen at Lonesome and Galehead. The entry was simple. Weather coming in, pushing forward anyway. See you up the trail. I did see him, one more time, but not in person. Near the end of my White Mountain section, at a road crossing, there was a laminated photo attached to a post. In memory of same picture I'd shown him on my phone. Same grin, same trailhead sign. People had left little notes in Sharpie around the edges. We'll carry you the rest of the way. Touching the sign for you this year, brother. You're still walking with us. I stood there longer than I should have, traffic whispering past behind me, the woods dense and watchful on both sides. For a moment, just one heartbeat-long slip. I thought I saw a familiar shape moving through the trees on the far side of the road. Tall, lean, pack bouncing slightly with each step, not looking back. If you hike enough miles in these mountains, you collect stories, whether close calls, animal encounters, bad decisions that went somehow right. This one, I don't tell it on trail much. It sounds too much like a campfire fabrication. But sitting here with you, in the relative safety of four walls and level ground, I'll say this. If you ever keep leapfrogging the same hiker in the whites, and their timing doesn't make sense, and you start seeing their name where it shouldn't be kind. Share food, swap stories. But when the trail splits, and you have to decide whether to follow their steps exactly, give them the courtesy of walking your own line. Some people are out there finishing a hike they never got to log, and the last thing they need is for the living to get tangled in their unfinished miles. If we were talking about this face-to-face, this is the part where I'd lean in a little and tell you that what scared me most up there wasn't a ghost or an animal or even the dark. It was my own equipment trying to talk me out of dying, not a voice. Not a warning on the radio, just numbers on a screen rearranging themselves into a single word over and over. Leave. You can decide later if I saw what I wanted to see, or if the mountain used the only language it knew I'd listen to. I'm a geology grad student, or I was before this. My thesis is on avalanche paths and recurring slide zones in the White Mountains, especially the old Giant's Grave area below Mount Washington. It's a scarred basin of broken rock and regrown forest where a massive slide came down in the 1800s and killed more than one person who thought they understood the mountain better than they did. Perfect case study, right? Historic event, observable slope, plenty of tea-stained papers written by long, dead surveyors to cross-reference. The problem was, my advisor wanted fresh data, ground-penetrating radar, soil cores, controlled microblasts to read subsurface layering. We're not just reading history, he said. We're poking it. That sentence should have bothered me more than it did. Our little field team was 3 people. Me, another grad student who lived for explosives, and a senior prof who loved big, dangerous geology a little too much. We hiked in over 2 days with sleds and packs full of gear, set up camp near the base of the old slide path, and started doing what we do best, measuring. We ran shallow radar transects across the lower runout, drilled cores to analyze grain size and moisture content, placed sensors to record any micro movements in the slope. All very technical, very controlled. If you'd walked by, you'd have seen 3 nerds in hard hats arguing over soil stratigraphy while the mountains watched. The first weirdness came from the radar. If you've never used GPR, it basically sends pulses into the ground and reads the reflections, giving you a cross-section image of what's down there. Layers, voids, buried boulders. We started getting anomalies right away, not unheard of. Rocks do strange things to signals. But these were regular. Every pass across the main chute, somewhere between 2 and 3 meters down. The return would spike in a way that made the software flag it bright red. The shape of the anomaly varied slightly with each sweep, but when the data rendered on the laptop, the pixels seemed to clump in one section of the screen, almost like they were being pulled toward each other. Could be buried timber from the old slide, the prof said, squinting at the display. Root balls, debris. We're overthinking it. He tapped the screen, where the red clusters were thickest. This is the juicy part. This is where we set the charges, pop the crust, see how it reacts. Good data. I remember rubbing my thumb over the edge of the laptop, the plastic warm from hours of running, and feeling this low, crawling unease. The way those anomalies gathered together on the image, it looked less like random geology and more like letters almost forming, like someone trying to write with a shaking hand. I dismissed it as my overactive brain looking for patterns. That's what human brains do. We find faces in toast, shapes in clouds, words in noise. It's practically our default setting. We marked out a small grid over the area of interest, stakes in the snow, bright flagging tape snapping in the wind. My explosives-loving teammate started prepping the microcharges. These weren't Hollywood blasts, nothing that would level a hillside. Just controlled pops to vibrate the subsurface enough that our sensors could read the response and build a model. That's the line I kept telling myself anyway, as we buried neat little packets of potential energy into a slope that had already proved once that it could kill. Back at the laptop, monitoring the sensors, I watched numbers scroll and line graphs draw themselves in real time. Temperature, moisture, microstrain, all the quantifiable details that make mountains feel briefly, comfortingly, like problems you can solve instead of places that can swallow you. The wind had picked up, worrying at my hood. The sky had that flat white look that says, snow coming, but not yet. The prof gave the go-ahead. My teammate's voice crackled over the handheld, charge one in place, on your count. Here's where it started to go wrong in a way I can't shake off as coincidence. Right as I opened my mouth to say 3, 2, 1, the GPR unit, still technically idle on the side table, spiked. No one had touched it. No one had run a new pass. But its little status screen lit up, and the live preview window, which should have been blank, filled with frantic scatter. I looked down automatically, annoyed, ready to tap it back to standby. The scatter stopped. The pixels settled. LEAVE4, jagged letters, crudely formed but unmistakable, sat in the middle of the radar preview. The L was a short vertical streak connected to a longer one. The E was 3 horizontal smears crossing a spine. The A was a peaked triangle. The V was 2 angling scratches. Any one of them alone I could have dismissed. Together, all at once, coalescing from what should have been meaningless reflections, my mouth went dry. Hold on a sec, I said into the radio, voice coming out hoarser than I wanted. We've got an equipment issue. Stand by. The prof rolled his eyes. The mountain's not going to write you love letters, he said. That's noise. Reset and get on with it. I stared at the screen. The letters didn't flicker. They just sat there, as if waiting for me to argue. I tried to clear the feed, cycling the unit through a hard reset. The preview blanked, rebooted, returned to baseline. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd imagined it. Then the trace started up again on its own, and the same shapes crawled out from the mess of lines and dots, more defined this time. Leave. The E at the end smudged, like whatever was doing this wasn't used to the alphabet. I can hear you thinking, glitch, pareidolia. Your brain wanted out, so it shoved letters into noise. Believe me, I wanted that to be true. I forced myself to look away, to deliberately think in technical terms. We're getting non-random noise on the GPR, I said. We should acknowledge your nerves and move on, the prof cut in. This slide path has been dormant for over a century. The conditions are stable. The charges are tiny. You did the models yourself. Are you saying they're wrong? That's the trap in science. You stake your pride on your numbers. Admitting you don't trust them anymore feels like admitting you don't trust yourself. I swallowed, shame burning hotter than the fear. No, I said eventually. The models are solid. Then stop anthropomorphizing the equipment, he said. Count it down. I should have walked away. I know that now in a way that sits in my bones, but in that moment, I let embarrassment overrule instinct. I turned the GPR screen face down on the table and lifted the radio. The first charge went off with a muffled thump. A little puff of snow shook free downslope. The sensors dutifully read the vibration and spat data into a waiting file. No immediate response from the slope. No ominous cracks, no slide. For 10 long minutes, nothing happened except the slow hiss of my own breathing in my ears. The prof looked smug. See, he said, the mountain's not cursed. Its layers and angles and gravity. On to charge 2. When I righted the GPR to check a connection, the preview was already scrolling again. I almost didn't look. Curiosity got me. I wish it hadn't. This time the letters were bigger, bolder. They formed so fast I saw them arrive stroke by stroke, like someone was writing inside the ground and the unit was just a scanner. LEAVE, no wobble, no hesitation. And underneath, as the trace continued to build, a new line started. STOP. I didn't think. I acted. Abort, I snapped into the radio. Do not detonate to. Repeat, do not. The radio cut to a wall of static mid-word. Not the usual burst of interference. A solid, teeth-gritting roar that blotted out everything else. Simultaneously, every sensor graph on the laptop jumped. Not in the clean wave pattern you expect from a small blast, but in a jagged, sustained spike that rolled across the screen like a heartbeat gone berserk. Then the ground moved. There is a difference. Your body learns between you moving over the earth and the earth moving under you. One is choice. The other is not. The snow at my feet lurched downslope an inch, then 3, then more. It was subtle at first, like standing on the deck of a ship feeling it list. Above us, somewhere in the white, something deep let go with a low, grinding moan. My teammate's voice finally cut back in over the static, high and strangled. We've got cracking up here. The whole face is webbing. What did you... He didn't finish. The hillside did instead. The sound that followed is something I still hear at night sometimes, when the house is too quiet. A roar made of 1,000 smaller sounds. Trees snapping, boulders grinding, layers of snow shearing and slamming together. The slope that had been dormant for over a century decided in that moment that it was done waiting. I don't have a clear cinematic memory of what happened over the next 30 seconds. Trauma folds time. I remember the prof screaming, "Run!" and already being in motion, feet skating over suddenly treacherous snow. I remember losing my footing and sliding, hands clawing for purchase on anything solid. I remember glancing upslope once, stupidly, and seeing the whole upper section of the chute coming apart like a slow white wave, trees and rocks tumbling in its belly. What I remember most, though, is the GPR screen, half buried where it had fallen off the table. The glass was cracked, the casing already filling with blowing snow. For a fraction of a heartbeat, as the world came down toward it, the display flickered one last time. Not neat, typed letters now, but a tangle of lines that somehow, impossibly, still resolved into words my brain couldn't not read. Leave, leave, leave. And underneath, jammed into the corner like someone had written it hard and small, SORRY. We survived. That's the part the official report focuses on. The slide was big, but it broke higher than expected, fanned out before it reached us fully. The microcharge never detonated. My teammate had frozen instead of triggering it, and that pause might have saved all our lives. We were bruised, half buried, shaken to the core, but alive. Our equipment did not fare as well. Most of it was crushed or lost under debris. The GPR was a write-off. Insurance forms were filed. The incident was chalked up to unexpected instability due to subsurface conditions not visible at time of assessment. No one wrote, in any official capacity, slope exhibited apparent desire not to be prodded, or Equipment attempted to warn idiot humans before they did something catastrophic. I didn't dare mention the words I'd seen. Scientists already have enough trouble being taken seriously when they talk about gut feelings. But off the record, sitting in quiet corners with other field researchers who've spent too many nights on too many precarious slopes, you hear things. Stories about barometers spinning wildly when there's no pressure change. Seismographs scribbling nonsense, only for a landslide to rumble down 5 minutes later. GPS units refusing to lock in certain basins, as if distance itself were bendable. I don't go back to Giant's Grave. Someone else can analyze that data, build their models, publish their papers with tidy graphs and citations. I changed my thesis topic. I dream of that cracked screen more than I admit. Sometimes, when I'm out on a local hill doing something as gentle as mapping a drumlin in spring sunshine, my phone will glitch. The text will stutter. For half a second, a random app name will smear into 4 letters it was never meant to spell, and my breath will catch until it snaps back to normal. If there's anything I want you to take from this, it's not that mountains are haunted in the ghost story sense. It's that they are old. Old in a way our little instruments barely know how to translate. We jab them with charges and call it research. Sometimes, maybe, they jab back in the only way they can, by shoving a message through whatever hardware we've stuck in their skin. So if you're ever standing on a slope in the whites, gear humming, numbers scrolling, and the noise suddenly looks like it's spelling you a word, do yourself a favor and believe it the first time. Some places don't want to be understood. They just want to be left alone. If you ever end up doing winter checks for the huts, you're going to hear a lot of bragging and a lot of stories, but nobody's going to tell you what it feels like to unlock a building that's supposed to be empty and smell someone's cooking. Not wood smoke, not old grease, fresh food. That smell, sitting where it has no right to be, is what still wakes me up sometimes. So I want you to picture this like you're sitting next to me at a kitchen table, coffee going cold, while the wind rattles the windows, and we both pretend not to look toward the mountains. I do winter facilities work for the AMC. Off-season, when the huts are shut down and boarded up, a few of us go up on a rotating schedule and make sure nothing's broken, nothing's leaking, nothing's nesting where it shouldn't. Madison Spring Hut is one of the tougher ones in winter. Just getting there is half the battle. Valley Way in February will make you believe in things you laughed at in October. But I've always liked that kind of quiet. The deep snow hush and the way your world compresses to the circle of your headlamp. This run was supposed to be routine. Load up at Appalachia, grind up Valley Way in the gray light, pop out above tree line in the afternoon, check Madison, sleep in the hut, back down in the morning. The forecast was cold but clear, the kind of high-pressure dome that makes the stars feel too close. I remember feeling almost eager. I like seeing the huts asleep, stripped of the summer chaos. It feels like being backstage in an empty theater. The hike up was textbook winter misery, which is to say, it was fine. Snowshoes for the lower half, spikes higher up, the usual alternating layers game. The forest was quiet in that way where every noise is amplified. One chickadee sounds like a whole flock. One branch creak sounds like a gunshot. As I climbed, the trees thinned, the wind picked up, and that familiar ache settled into my legs. Nothing weird, nothing ominous, just cold, effort, breath. Madison Spring Hut sits in a little bowl between peaks, a low stout shape that looks like it's bracing itself against the weather, even in good conditions. In winter, everything around it smooths out. The drifts build into soft curves, and only the angles of the roof and the chimneys break the snow. From a distance, it looked right. No collapsed sections, no alarming patterns in the snow that would suggest something had gone very wrong while nobody was looking. Up close, it didn't. The first thing was the tracks. There shouldn't have been any. Winter access is limited, and I was the first one up since the last documented check, a month earlier. The wind and fresh snow should have erased anything older than a few days anyway. But there they were, leading from the direction of Valley Way. Boot prints. One pair. Deep, precise impressions, not softened by drift or scuffed by wind. They went straight to the hut's main door. The second thing hit me when I climbed the last rise and the wind shifted. That smell. Not just wood smoke, though that was there too, thin and acidic in the cold air. Under it, thicker, richer, cooking. The greasy, unmistakable scent of something frying. Oil, maybe onions, in a building that should have been locked, dark, heatless. Every sensible instinct I had told me to stop on that spot of frozen snow and call someone. At the very least, assume a trespasser. Maybe a desperate one, half frozen, not thinking straight. But there's another voice that gets trained into you doing this work. The "your job is to go look" voice, and that one won. I tightened the strap on my pack, shifted my grip on my poles, and followed the boot prints up to the porch. The door was closed, but not latched. That's a detail that's going to sound small to you sitting comfortably where you are. Up there, in February, it's wrong on a bone-deep level. We triple-check latches before we leave in the fall. A door left unsecured can be the difference between a dry hut and a ruined shell. I eased it open with gloved fingers, letting my headlamp beam cut through the dim. The lights were on. Not all of them. Just a few in the main room, throwing a weak, yellowish glow over tables and benches. The wood stove in the corner was alive, a dull, steady red through the grate, radiating a heat I could feel from the doorway. My breath, which had been fogging thick in the outside air, thinned and vanished as I stepped inside. Silence wrapped the room, thick and total. No footsteps, no clatter, no voice calling out, "Hey, sorry. I just needed to get warm." On the nearest table there was a plate, metal, one of ours. On it, neat as you please, sat 2 pieces of bread. Old style, rough, like the kind we demo for historical programs sometimes, and a small slab of something that might have been meat once. The food was untouched but not frozen. Grease from the meat had soaked a translucent circle into the bread. Beside the plate lay a fork, placed carefully, tines aligned with the plate's edge. I remember standing there, in my snow-crusted shells, dripping slowly onto the floor, looking at that table setting, and feeling every hair on my arms lift. We don't leave supplies like that out in winter. Food gets sealed, packed, locked against mice. Nobody had radioed that someone was up here. Nobody else's gear was by the door. The bunks, when I checked them, were made up the way we leave them, blankets stacked, mattresses bare. Except one. In the back corner, on a lower bunk, someone had made a bed. Not with the random, messy efficiency of a tired hiker who knows nobody's grading their hospital corners. This was a careful, deliberate arrangement. Mattress pulled down, blankets layered just so, pillow plumped. And on that pillow lay a wool hat, the old hand-knit kind, folded in half. I touched nothing. That might be the only smart decision I made for the next hour. Instead, I did what I'd come there to do. I walked the hut, clipboard in hand, pen scratching on pre-printed forms. Roof sound, windows intact, no evidence of leakage. It felt obscene going through the motions in that warm, ghost-occupied space, but the routine gave my hands something to do, while my brain tried to keep from bolting. Everywhere I went, there were little signs that the place wasn't empty. A cup, rinsed but not dried, upside down on the counter. A chair pulled slightly away from the table. A damp ring on wood where something hot had been set down. But there were no wet boot prints on the floor. The tracks outside ended at the doorway. Inside, the boards were dry and clean. It was as if whoever was using the hut didn't bring the outside in with them. I saved the logbook for last. It sits on its shelf near the door, leather cover worn, pages filled with cramped notes and tidy check marks. We sign in for every visit. Date, time, weather, condition notes. I flip back to the last entry. 4 weeks ago. Different tech, familiar handwriting. Cabin secure. No issues. Temps low. All shutters holding. I turned the page. The next entry was dated wrong. 3 days ago, according to the line. Same format. Cabin secure. Occupant comfortable. Storm outside. Heat good. There was no printed name, just a single initial. The handwriting was old-fashioned. Loops and flourishes you don't see much anymore. But what made my stomach drop was the style of the date. Day first, then month, then year written out. No slashes. No abbreviations. My grandfather had written dates that way. None of my colleagues did. I flipped back further, pulse rising. There, scattered through the years, were more entries that didn't belong in any official log. Always in the cold months. Always with some small note about occupant. Always with dates that, when I did the math, lined up with the now legendary storm of 67, the brutal winter of 78, the nor'easter in 93. Occupant restless. Occupant quiet tonight. Occupant asked about the trail. No names, just that word. Like the hut itself was a hospital, and someone was perpetually on the edge of discharge. There is a story that floats around the clubs, told more often after the lights are low and the bottle's gone around a few times, about a hiker who took shelter at Madison during a surprise winter storm decades ago. You'll hear different versions. Some say he was a solo hiker, some say he was with a group that left and he stayed, but they all end the same way. He didn't make it down, caught between storms, snowbound, body never recovered. People say he's still up there, waiting it out. I'd always laughed it off as a cautionary tale wearing a bedsheet. Standing in that dim, warm hut, with the storm warning still clear in my memory from the valley forecast, I wasn't laughing. I should have called it in. Should have gotten on the radio, said, "We've got evidence of an unauthorized occupant probably in distress." But the words wouldn't come, because the shape I kept seeing in my mind's eye wasn't some modern trespasser. It was a figure in old wool layers and leather boots, sitting patiently at that table, waiting for a storm to end that had blown itself out 50 years ago. Night came down hard and fast while I was wrestling with myself. One moment, the windows showed gray-brown slopes and sky. The next, the world outside was just flat black, cut by occasional streaks of white when the wind threw snow against the glass. The stove ticked as it cycled heat. Somewhere in the rafters, the old beams gave a series of slow, settling pops. I made a choice then that I've replayed too many times. I left the bunk as I found it. I did not strip it, did not fold the blankets back onto the shelf. I unrolled my own bag on a different bunk, closer to the door, like some part of me wanted a head start if things went wrong. The logbook lay on the table between us, spine cracked, open to that last strange entry. Outside, the wind built. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the door latch moving, not slamming, not rattling, just the soft, careful click of someone who knows how to open a door without wasting heat. I held my breath. The room was almost completely dark. The stove had burned low, and only a faint red glow outlined shapes. I didn't sit up, didn't call out. I just listened. The door opened, and with it came a knife of cold air that sliced through my bag like it wasn't there. Footsteps crossed the floor, bare, by the sound, or in socks, the soft pad of flesh on wood. They didn't leave wet prints. I could see that much, faintly, because whoever had come in walked right past the foot of my bunk between me and the stove. I caught a shape then, a darker darkness against the room. Tallish. Broad-shouldered, under layers that didn't quite match the silhouettes of modern gear. The smell that trailed with it was not rot, not anything ugly. It was human. Wool, old smoke, the ghost of sweat. The figure paused by the table. There was the sound of ceramic on wood, metal on ceramic, the clink of a fork being lifted and set down. A long, slow sigh escaped into the room. Not a dramatic moan, not a creak of supernaturally disused lungs. Just the soft exhale of someone very tired. I don't know how long it went on. Time in that half-wakefulness is slippery. At some point, the chair scraped quietly. Cloth rustled. The sense of a presence moved away from the table back toward that made-up bunk in the corner. Springs creaked under new weight. Another sigh, this one edged with something like relief. Then nothing but wind and my own too-fast heartbeat. I must have slept again because the next thing I clearly remember is pale light leaking around the shutters and the sound of the stove snapping as it cooled. The bunk in the corner was empty. The plate and fork were gone. The door was latched from the inside. There was a new line in the logbook. Same hand, same looping script. Date, that day. Occupant slept well. Storm passed. He can stay. That he sat in my chest like a weight. I checked the hut one more time. Every corner, every closet, every crawl space. No footprints that hadn't been there. No extra gear. No sign of anyone living in the way the living do. When I stepped outside, the snow was clean, sculpted into fresh drifts that showed only my own path from the day before. Down in the valley, when I turned in my forms, I left that last page of the logbook blank on my report. Wrote, Madison secure, no issues, structure sound. On the line about unauthorized use, I ticked no. It wasn't exactly a lie. Whoever I'd shared that hut with didn't feel unauthorized. If anything, I did. I haven't been assigned to Madison for winter checks since. Part of me is grateful. Part of me wonders who's been writing the rest of those unsanctioned entries, winter after winter, decade after decade, whether the occupant ever chooses to leave, or if the hut has become his whole world, a waiting room at the edge of the storm that never quite calls his name. What I can tell you, here where it's safe, and there's probably a roof over your head that no one died under, is this. If you ever get the keys to a mountain building in the off-season, and you walk in to find the bed made and the stove warm, don't jump to the worst kind of fear first. There are worse fates than being haunted. One of them is being trapped in a night that never ends, halfway between going home and never getting there. And if some part of these old huts has decided to make room for that kind of unfinished business, the kindest thing you can do might be exactly what I did. Leave the bed made, close the log, latch the door from the inside just once, and walk away.